My daughter walked off that plane holding 2 boarding passes with both our names on them, like she'd packed my whole life into a folder before she hugged me. I'd been in Iloilo 11 months. I had a lease, a landlord I was fighting, a woman down the street who fed me when I forgot to eat, and a doctor who knew my blood pressure better than my daughter did. Diane came to take me home. She had it planned down to the connecting flight. By the end of that week, one ticket never got used, and it wasn't mine. I'm getting ahead of myself. That's a habit of mine, starting at the part that scares me most and working backward. And if I don't slow down, you'll think I know how this story ends better than I actually did while I was living it. Before I go any further, if you're the kind of person who likes hearing stories like this one, do me a favor and hit subscribe. I've got more of these to tell, and I'd like you along for the rest of them. So let me back up. 2 years before any of that, I was still in Wisconsin, in the house Nancy and I bought the year Diane was born, and I was making coffee for 2 people every morning, even though only one of us was left to drink it. I'd pour the second cup out of habit, stand there holding the pot, and then pour it down the sink like I was disposing of evidence. Nancy died of pancreatic cancer. 7 months from diagnosis to the funeral, and I did everything a person is supposed to do. Drove her to every appointment, learned to read the labels on 9 different pill bottles, held her hand in that recliner of hers until her hand stopped holding back. I did it right. That's the part I keep coming back to. I did it right and she died anyway. And somewhere in there I stopped being anybody's husband and didn't become anything else. I taught shop class for 34 years. Industrial arts, they called it toward the end, which always struck me as a fancier name for teaching kids not to lose a finger to a table saw. I knew how to frame a wall, wire a panel, read a level. I didn't know what to do with an empty house at 5 in the morning, which is when I used to get up for work and kept getting up anyway, long after there was no work to get up for. I'd stand in the garage some mornings, flip the light on over the workbench, and just look at Nancy's gardening gloves hanging on a nail by the door where she'd left them the last spring she was well enough to plant anything. I never moved them. I never used the bench for much either, not for a long time. I'd just stand there in the cold with my coffee going lukewarm in my hand. There was a fellow named Pete Sorensen who lived 2 houses down, retired postal worker, and for a while he'd stop by on Saturdays to see if I wanted to help him with something around his place. A fence, a gutter, whatever needed doing. I went along for the first few months because it gave the day a shape. Somewhere around the 1-year mark, I stopped answering the door when I saw his truck. I'm not proud of that. He never said anything about it. Just left a jar of his wife's tomato preserves on my porch every so often, like he was checking whether I was still in there. I went to church less too, though I never told anyone that outright. Nancy had been the one who kept us going most Sundays, and after she died, I found I couldn't sit in that pew without seeing the empty space beside me, so I stopped going altogether rather than face it. The pastor called a few times. I let it go to voicemail more than once, which isn't something I'm proud of either, but it's the truth of where I was. Diane started calling every day. Not every other day. Every day at the same time, like a shift change. Just checking in, Dad. She'd ask what I ate. She'd ask if I'd been outside. Once she left a folder on my kitchen counter after a visit, and I didn't open it for 3 days because I already knew what was in it before I looked. Glossy photographs of a place called Maple Ridge Senior Living, a woman in a cardigan pointing at a garden that didn't exist yet. I put the folder in a drawer. I told Diane I'd think about it, which was a lie I was comfortable telling because it kept her off the phone for a day. What I didn't tell her was that I'd stopped cleaning the gutters, that the porch step had a soft spot I kept meaning to fix and didn't, that I'd started leaving mail unopened on the table in a stack that grew like something alive, bills and catalogs and a card from my sister. I didn't open for 2 weeks because I didn't have it in me to read anything sympathetic that month. She didn't know any of that, not because I was hiding a secret exactly, but because admitting it out loud would have meant admitting she was right to worry, and some stubborn piece of me wasn't ready to hand her that. I want to say something about Diane here before I go further, because it would be easy for you to hear this story and think of her only as the woman who showed up with 2 tickets and start forming an opinion about her before you know the first thing about who she actually is. She's a hospital billing administrator, has been for 15 years, married to a good man named Mark. 2 teenagers who barely look up from their phones when I call, which is about right for their age. I remember being the same. She organized Nancy's entire funeral in 4 days flat, called the florist and the church and the caterer, and never once let anyone see her hands shake while she was doing it. And only fell apart afterward, alone, in her car, in my driveway, which I only know because I happened to look out the window at the wrong moment. She's the kind of person who takes care of everybody, and then doesn't know what to do when there's nobody left assigned to take care of her. The Philippines came into it sideways, the way most important things do. There was a man named Tony Marasigan I'd known from the Union Hall 30 years back, retired electrician, and he'd moved back to his mother's hometown outside Iloilo City a few years after I lost track of him. He found me on Facebook, of all things, and sent me a photograph from some barangay fiesta, himself, grinning, sunburned, surrounded by people half his age who all seemed to know him. He wrote, "Walt, you old dog, you still alive up there in the snow?" I wrote back something short. He wrote back longer. That was how it started. Not with a decision, just a conversation that didn't stop. I began watching videos late at night after I told myself I was going to bed. Retired Americans sitting on porches talking about their pensions, stretching further than they ever had at home, talking about neighbors who noticed if you didn't come outside for a day. I did the math against my Social Security and my teacher's pension, twice, because I didn't trust the first time. I wrote the numbers down on the back of an old grade sheet I found in a drawer. The way I used to figure lumber costs for a project before I let a class near the table saw. Rent, food, a little cushion for emergencies. It looked possible in a way nothing in Wisconsin had looked possible in 2 years. I looked up hospitals. I read forum posts written by men who sounded like me. Men who'd lost a wife, lost a routine, and found something else without exactly meaning to look for it. Some of the posts scared me. Somebody's savings gone to a landlord who vanished. Somebody's family cut off entirely. Somebody who fell in a bathroom and lay there 2 days before a neighbor thought to check. I read those too because I wasn't foolish enough to only read the good ones. One night, I fell down a rabbit hole reading about visa categories until nearly 3 in the morning, comparing a retiree visa against just renewing a tourist stamp every couple months. Weighing the extra paperwork against the extra security of having something more permanent. I made a pot of coffee I didn't need at that hour just to have something to do with my hands while I read. Carol used to tell me I processed everything through my hands, that I couldn't think a problem all the way through unless I was holding something. She wasn't wrong. I sat there turning an old pencil over and over while I clicked through forum threads, like the motion itself was helping me decide. I told Diane none of it. By spring, I'd listed the house. Nancy's house, technically, since her name had been on it as long as mine, and there was something in signing that paperwork that felt like betraying her and honoring her at the same time, though I couldn't have explained the difference if you'd asked me. I signed a 6-month lease on an apartment in Iloilo City that Tony had walked through on my behalf, sent me photographs of, told me not to worry about. I did all of it before I said a word to my daughter, and I know exactly how that sounds now. She found out because she drove up on a Saturday and saw the realtor's sign in the yard before I'd even worked out how to tell her. "You listed the house." She wasn't asking. "I was going to call you this week." "You were going to call me." "Dad, this was Mom's house." "I know whose house it was." "Do you?" "Because it doesn't look like it. It looks like you're running away from it." We went back and forth like that for the better part of an hour in the kitchen, both of us standing because sitting would have made it feel like a conversation instead of a fight. She brought up Maple Ridge again. I told her I didn't need a garden with a woman in a cardigan pointing at it. She asked what I even knew about the Philippines besides an old co-worker's Facebook photos. I told her I knew enough. She asked how I'd pay for a doctor 8,000 miles away if something happened. And I didn't have a real answer for that one, so I made a joke instead, something about how nothing had happened to me in Wisconsin except boredom, and she didn't laugh. "Do you know what it's like?" she said. "Getting a call in the middle of a shift, and it's a nurse from some hospital I've never heard of, and I don't even know if I can get on a plane fast enough." "Nobody's called you from a hospital yet." "That's not the point, Dad, and you know it." "Then what is the point, Diane? Because from where I'm standing, the point is you'd rather I sit in that house getting smaller and smaller where you can drive by and check on me than go do something that actually feels like living." "You didn't even ask me," she said, and her voice cracked in a way that surprised us both. "I'm not asking permission," I said. "I'm 71 years old." She left without finishing her coffee. I stood in that kitchen a long time after her car pulled out of the driveway, looking at the 2 mugs on the counter, hers still half full. And I thought about pouring it out the way I used to pour out Nancy's. And instead, I just left it sitting there and went and sat in the garage for a while with the light off. The morning I flew out, there was a text from her sitting unanswered on my phone from the night before. Just 3 words. "Call me first." And I hadn't, because I was afraid of what calling her would talk me out of. I packed light. 1 suitcase, the wheel already cracked from some trip Nancy and I took years back that I never bothered fixing. On top, wrapped in a sweater, I put the framed photograph from our wedding, the 2 of us younger than Diane is now, and it was the last thing I saw before I zipped the bag shut and the first thing I thought about somewhere over the Pacific when I couldn't sleep. I also packed, without really thinking about why, one of Nancy's gardening gloves, just the left one, folded flat in a side pocket where it wouldn't take up room. I don't know what I thought I was going to do with it. I still have it. 16 hours to Manila with a layover in Chicago that felt longer than the flight itself. Then a short hop down to Iloilo that I spent with my forehead against the window, watching the water change color as we came in low over the coast. The airport wasn't what I expected, and I'm not sure what I expected. Fluorescent light, humid enough that my shirt stuck to my back before I'd even cleared customs, a driver Tony had arranged holding a piece of cardboard with my name spelled wrong. Hendricks instead of Hendricks. Which struck me as funny in a way I badly needed something to strike me as funny right then. The ride into the city was loud. Tricycles buzzing past on both sides, jeepneys painted like something out of a carnival, horns that didn't seem angry so much as constant, like a language I hadn't learned yet. I sat in the back of that little vehicle with my cracked suitcase wedged against my knees, and I thought, not for the first time, that I had no earthly idea what I'd just done. I remember passing a row of little shops with their metal shutters half down for the evening, a group of kids kicking a half-flat ball around under a street lamp, and thinking that none of it looked like the videos I'd watched. And also that none of it looked like anything I needed to be afraid of, which surprised me more than either fact on its own would have. 9 days went by before I heard from Diane again. 9 days of silence longer than any gap we'd ever had, even during the worst of Nancy's illness, even during the fight over the house. I checked my phone more than I'd admit to anyone. I told myself she needed time. I told myself a lot of things that week, lying in an apartment that smelled like someone else's cleaning products, listening to a city I didn't recognize yet, breathing outside my window, waiting to find out whether my daughter was ever going to speak to me again. I told myself the silence would break on its own, and it did, but not the way I expected. The apartment Tony found me was smaller than the photographs had made it look, which I suppose is true of most things people photograph to sell. 1 bedroom, a kitchen no bigger than a closet, water pressure that dropped to nothing most afternoons for reasons nobody could ever fully explain to me. The street noise started around 5 in the morning and didn't let up. Roosters first, then the tricycles, then a woman 2 doors down who ran a little carinderia and greeted every single person who walked past her stall like they were the first person she'd seen all week. I lay awake the first few nights waiting for it to bother me the way I assumed it would. Instead, I slept. Not right away, not that first week, but by the second, I was sleeping through till morning for the first time since before Nancy got sick. I didn't examine that too closely at the time. I just noticed it, the way you notice your knee doesn't hurt one day and don't ask why. The woman who ran the carinderia was named Elena. Everybody called her Ellie. And for the first 2 weeks, I assumed she was working an angle on me. Every American who walks down that street probably gets a big smile and a "Kumusta, sir?" And I figured mine came with a markup. I started counting my change after every meal, which is an ugly thing to admit, and one afternoon she caught me doing it, counting coins right there in front of her like she couldn't see me. She didn't get angry. She just laughed, not unkindly, and told me I'd overpaid her by about 40 pesos and pushed it back across the counter. "You don't have to do that," I said. "I know I don't have to," she said. I did it anyway. I felt about 2 inches tall. I'd been in the country 3 weeks, and I'd already decided everybody wanted something from me. And here was a woman who was raising her nephew alone, running a business the size of my old garage, handing back money I would never have missed. I apologized. She waved it off like it wasn't worth the breath, then asked me, half joking, whether Americans always counted their food like they were being cheated, and I didn't have a good answer for that either. I noticed after that I stopped counting. I started eating there most days, not because it was convenient, though it was, but because there was something about sitting at that little plastic table watching her run the place, scolding a delivery boy, arguing good-naturedly with a regular about the price of rice, snapping at her nephew to finish his homework before he touched his phone. That reminded me being around a person who was actually living her life, rather than managing mine, was a thing I'd been missing longer than I realized. Some evenings, I'd stay past closing and help her stack the plastic chairs, sweep the little concrete floor, carry the empty gas canister out back for the next day's delivery. She never asked me to. I just started doing it. The way I used to stay late at school helping a student finish a project even after the bell rang, because there was something in the doing of it that settled me. She teased me once that I was the only foreigner she'd ever met who volunteered to sweep, and I told her it was cheaper than therapy. And she laughed loud enough that a couple of the regulars looked over. The money situation wasn't imaginary, though, even if my suspicion of Ellie had been misplaced. My bank transfers were taking longer than I'd planned for, some new security hold every time I moved anything over a certain amount, which meant more than once I sat in that little apartment doing arithmetic on a napkin, wondering if I'd have enough cash on hand to cover the week. There was also a homeowners association fee on the apartment that Tony's contact had mentioned almost in passing, an amount that seemed to grow a little every month without much explanation attached to it. I asked about it once. I got a shrug and a promise that it evens out. I didn't push. I told myself I was still learning how things worked here, and that not every unfamiliar system was a scam, and both of those things were true, which is probably how people talk themselves into losses. I paid it. I told no one. Small things happened that week that I didn't have a category for yet. The barangay captain, a man everyone called Kapit Nestor, stopped me on the street the 3rd week and used my actual name, not Sir, not Joe, the way some of the younger kids called every foreigner, my actual name Walt, like he'd taken the trouble to learn it. A boy from the building found my reading glasses where I'd left them on a bench by the river and ran 2 blocks to catch me before I got home. An old woman who sold vegetables from a cart started saving me the good tomatoes before anybody else could get to them, for no reason I ever figured out, except that I'd complimented her produce once, weeks earlier, and apparently that had been enough. Back in Wisconsin, I could go a week without a single person outside Diane's phone calls knowing whether I was alive. Here, apparently, if I didn't show up somewhere for a day, somebody noticed. Tony made himself useful in ways I hadn't expected to need. He walked me through opening a local account, got me a SIM card, sat with me at an office downtown while I filled out the paperwork for a retiree visa that would let me stay longer than the tourist stamp allowed. That office visit alone took most of a day. Forms in triplicate. A fee I hadn't budgeted for. A clerk who sent me back twice for documents nobody had mentioned the first time. Tony sat through all of it without complaint, translating when the clerk's patience ran thinner than her English. And by the end of it, I understood a little better why he'd told me early on not to come here expecting things to move the way they moved back home. He introduced me to a clinic near the river. "Just in case," he said, "the way you say things you hope will stay hypothetical." And to a doctor there named Lisa Fernandez, who shook my hand and asked me real questions about my blood pressure instead of just handing me a pamphlet. Tony had his own story, which he told me over beer one night without much prompting. An American wife, 30 years of marriage, and when he decided to come home to the province, she wouldn't leave Sacramento. They were still married on paper, he said, in the way people stay married when neither one wants to be the one who ends it officially. He didn't dress it up as tragic. He just said it plain, the way a man says something he's made peace with only about 80% of the way. "She likes her garden and her book club," he told me, "and I like knowing everybody on my street." Neither one of us was wrong. We just wanted different endings. I thought about that a lot afterward. About how a person can do everything right and still end up alone in a country their spouse won't set foot in. I started spending afternoons with Ellie's nephew, a boy of maybe 10 named Ricky, helping him with his English reading. It began because I was sitting in her carinderia one day with nothing to do, and he was struggling through a school assignment at the next table, sounding out words slower than he should have been at his age. I leaned over without thinking about it and helped him with a word he was stuck on. Next thing I knew, it was most afternoons, an hour or so, him reading out loud and me correcting him. No money changing hands, nothing formal about it. Sometimes we'd get through a whole page without a single mistake, and he'd look up at me like he'd won something, and I'd tell him that's exactly what it felt like from where I was sitting too. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was just filling hours. It didn't occur to me until much later that it was the first thing I'd done in 2 years that wasn't about surviving my own day. Diane's silence broke on day 9 with a text that told me exactly nothing and everything at once. "Did you land okay, Dad?" No question mark. I read it maybe 6 times trying to find warmth in it, and mostly found relief that she hadn't cut me off entirely. I wrote back longer than I should have, telling her about the apartment, about Tony, leaving out the association fee, and leaving out the part where I'd been scared half to death the first week. She wrote back short again. Logistics. Had I registered with the embassy? Did I have a working phone number? It read like a woman checking boxes on a form, not a daughter talking to her father, and I told myself that was better than nothing, and it was, but it wasn't what I wanted. Over the next month, we settled into that pattern. She'd text about practical things. I'd answer. With more than she asked for, she'd respond with less than I hoped for. I told myself I was being patient. Some nights I wondered if I'd traded one kind of loneliness for another, just with better weather. The fee came due again the next month, and this time it had grown by an amount that made no sense even accounting for the vague explanations I'd been getting. I did the math and realized I'd handed over close to $2,000 more than any lease I'd ever seen justified. I sat with that number for a long evening, turning it over, telling myself it was still cheaper than what I'd have paid for a single month at Maple Ridge, which was true, and which was also the kind of thing a man tells himself right before he admits he's been taken advantage of. I didn't call Diane. I didn't call anyone. I just paid it again and made a note to ask Tony about it properly when I had the nerve. I want to be honest about why I didn't have the nerve, because it wasn't just pride, or it wasn't only pride. Some part of me was afraid that if I admitted I'd been careless with money 8,000 miles from home, it would confirm every single thing Diane had said in that kitchen, and I wasn't ready to hand her that particular victory yet, even quietly, even to myself. Then, about 6 weeks after I'd landed, my phone rang at an hour Diane didn't usually call, and her voice sounded different before she'd said more than my name. "Dad, I need to tell you something." A pause I didn't fill because I'd learned by then that filling her pauses usually made things worse. "Mark and I are taking some time apart, just to think. I don't want to get into all of it on the phone." I asked if she was all right. She said she was fine, too quickly, the way people say fine when they mean the opposite. "I think I'm going to come see you," she said. "Sort some things out." I asked when. She said she didn't have a date yet. She was still working it out. And something in the way she said it made me think she wasn't just working out a date. I assumed, because it was easiest to assume, that the trip was about me. About proving her fears right or wrong. About finishing the argument we'd started in that kitchen back home. I didn't stop to consider, not that night and not for a while after, that a woman who just told her father her marriage was in trouble might be coming 8,000 miles for reasons that had almost nothing to do with whether I could take care of myself. I hung up the phone and sat in that little apartment listening to the street outside settle into its nighttime version of itself. And I thought I understood exactly what was coming. I did not. I spent the 3 days before Diane's flight cleaning that apartment like it was up for inspection, which I suppose in a way it was. I scrubbed the little kitchen, hauled 2 loads of laundry to the place around the corner, moved the framed photograph of Nancy from the shelf where it usually sat to a spot where it would catch the light better, then moved it back because I decided that looked like I was trying too hard. I threw out a stack of takeout containers I'd been meaning to deal with for a week, wiped down a water stain on the ceiling I couldn't actually fix, and stood in the middle of the room at one point just looking at it the way I imagined Diane would see it, and not liking much of what I saw. I called Ellie and asked her, in about as many words as I could manage without sounding foolish, to just act normal when Diane came around. She looked at me like I'd asked her something strange. "Walt, I don't know how to act like anything else," she said, which didn't make me feel better exactly, but it made me laugh, and I needed that more than I needed to feel better. Tony told me to relax. I told him that was easy for a man who wasn't picking his daughter up from an airport with a folder of his failures tucked under her arm. He didn't argue with that, though he did offer, half serious, to make himself scarce for the week if it would help, and I told him no. Absolutely not, because if Diane was going to see this life at all, she was going to see the actual people in it. She came through customs at Iloilo pulling a small suitcase and holding a printed sheet of paper, and I knew before she even reached me what was on it. 2 tickets. My name typed next to hers, a return date circled in pen like she'd added that part herself after printing it, like the printer hadn't quite committed to the plan the way she had. "Before you say anything," she said, hugging me stiffly, "it's just an option. I didn't book anything you can't cancel." I didn't say anything. "You were about to." She wasn't wrong. I let it go for the ride back into the city, mostly because I didn't trust myself to argue with her before she'd even set her bag down. The first 2 days went about as well as you'd expect, which is to say, not very. She noticed the traffic before we'd even left the airport parking lot, the tricycles cutting across 3 lanes that didn't seem to exist as lanes at all. She noticed the heat, wiping her forehead within about 4 minutes of standing outside, asking whether it was always like this. She noticed the apartment. I watched her eyes move around it, doing an inventory she didn't think I could see. The small kitchen, the water stain on the ceiling I'd meant to ask the landlord about and hadn't. She didn't say anything cruel. She didn't have to. Her face did the talking. That first night she asked carefully whether I'd thought about what would happen if there was a typhoon, whether the building was even rated for that, and I told her I didn't know, which was true, and which did not go over well. "So what's this fee thing you mentioned in that one text?" she said the second morning, over coffee. Too casually for it to actually be casual, I told her it was nothing to worry about. I should have known better than to say that to a hospital billing administrator. She spent 15 years reading statements for a living, finding the charges that don't add up, and she looked at me the way she must look at a claim she doesn't believe. "Dad, how much?" I told her it wasn't a big deal. She asked again. I deflected again, made a joke about how everything costs more than you think it will, everywhere, always, and watched her face close up a little more with every word that wasn't an actual answer. She found the receipt 2 days later, folded into a drawer I hadn't thought to hide it in because I hadn't planned on her going through my drawers, which in hindsight was a foolish thing not to plan on. She came out holding it like evidence, which it was. "This is from 3 weeks ago. This is $2,000, Dad." Her voice had gone very flat, the way it does right before it isn't flat anymore. "Is this the only one?" I could have lied again. I'd been lying by omission for months at that point, and one more wouldn't have cost me anything new. But something about her face, not angry exactly, more like she was watching a thing she'd feared finally arrive, made the lie feel like more trouble than the truth. "No," I said. "There's more than that." I told her the whole thing then, sitting at that little kitchen table, the fee that had grown every month. A deposit I'd lost early on to a landlord's cousin who'd since stopped answering calls entirely. A loan I'd made to a friend of Tony's that I didn't expect to see repaid. All told, close to $9,000, gone in ways that would have sounded reckless if I'd described them out loud to anyone back home. And did sound reckless, saying them out loud to her. She didn't interrupt me while I talked, which was almost harder than if she had. She just sat with her hands flat on the table, listening to her father account for himself like he was one of her own claims. $9,000. She said the number like she was testing whether saying it out loud would make it feel any different. "Dad, that's... Do you understand what that is on your budget?" "I understand it fine." "Then why didn't you tell me?" "Because I knew exactly what you'd say." Maybe I'd have had a reason to say it. She didn't yell. That was almost worse. She just sat very still and said, "This is exactly what I was afraid of." And I understood that in her mind, the receipt in her hand had just proven every argument she'd made in that kitchen back in Wisconsin. What she didn't expect was what happened next, because I didn't just sit there and take it. I called Tony. Tony called Dr. Fernandez's clinic, and between the two of them and a conversation with Cap, Nestor, the following morning, I learned there was an actual process for this. A barangay mediation, a formal complaint against the landlord that other tenants had apparently filed before me. People in that community who knew exactly how to handle a man skimming fees off foreigners and newcomers. Diane sat in on the mediation meeting. She watched Cap Nestor speak with an authority that had nothing to do with a title and everything to do with people actually respecting him. She watched Tony translate the parts I couldn't follow, watched Dr. Fernandez's assistant, who happened to know the landlord's sister, quietly mention that this wasn't the fellow's first complaint. 2 other tenants showed up to add their own accounts to mine, unprompted. Once word got around, which surprised Diane more than it surprised me. Nobody fixed the money. I want to be honest about that. Most of it was gone for good, and everybody in that room knew it. But I watched something shift in Diane's face as she sat there, watching her father get treated not like a mark who'd wandered into trouble, but like a neighbor a community had decided to look out for. Afterward, walking back toward the apartment, she asked me quietly whether this happened often, foreigners getting taken advantage of. I told her honestly that it happened, that I'd read about it plenty before I ever got on the plane, and that I wasn't going to pretend it couldn't happen again. What I told her was that the difference wasn't whether bad things could happen here. Bad things could happen anywhere. The difference was whether anybody showed up when they did, and here they had. She didn't say much about it afterward. But she didn't bring up Maple Ridge again either. 3 days later, I collapsed on the walk back from the mediation office, halfway up a small hill I'd climbed 100 times without thinking twice about it. Heat mostly, and I hadn't been eating right that week with all the stress of Diane's visit, and I hadn't been drinking enough water, and I went down hard enough that I split my eyebrow on the curb and lay there for a minute not entirely sure what had just happened to me. I don't remember much of the next hour clearly, which I understand is normal. I remember Ellie's voice before I remember her face. I remember someone, Tony, it turned out, half carrying me the last stretch to the clinic. I remember asking, of all things, for the photograph in the blue frame, the one of Nancy, and someone, I still don't know who, actually went back to the apartment and brought it to me at the hospital, propped it on the little table by the bed like that mattered more than anything else in the room, which at the time, to me, it did. Diane reached the hospital maybe 20 minutes after I did, and by the time she got there, Dr. Fernandez had already started the IV, already had the intake paperwork moving, already had Ellie and Tony sitting with me so I wasn't alone in that room. Diane told me afterward she'd expected chaos. Instead, she found a doctor calmly explaining dehydration and heat exhaustion, a nurse checking my blood pressure with the same unhurried competence you'd hope for anywhere, and 2 people who weren't family sitting with her father like it was the most natural thing in the world. It wasn't a heart attack. I want to say that plainly because for about 10 minutes, before anybody had said anything definitive, I think we both believed it might be, and I watched something break open in her face during those 10 minutes that had nothing to do with hospitals or receipts. If this story's got you sitting there feeling something, do me a favor right now and drop a comment. Tell me where you're watching from or whether you've ever had a moment like the one I just described, where you thought the worst and got something else instead. And if you haven't already, hit that like button. It helps more than you'd think, and it costs you nothing but a second. We sat in that waiting area together once they'd gotten fluids into me and the worst of the scare had passed. And she started talking in a way she hadn't since before Nancy died. "I never really let myself grieve, Mom," she said, not looking at me. "I was so busy making sure you were okay, making sure the funeral went right, making sure you were eating, making sure, I don't even know. And then you moved here, and I told myself I was scared for your safety, and some of that's true, Dad. Some of it's real. But some of it's that I couldn't stand the idea of losing you too, and I never said that out loud to anyone, not even Mark." She stopped, started again. "Mark and I aren't just taking a break because we need space. We haven't been okay for a long time, and I've been using you as a reason not to deal with it." I asked her, gently as I could manage with a bandage over one eyebrow, what she meant by that. She told me it was easier to fly 8,000 miles and manage her father's crisis than sit in her own living room and manage her marriage. Easier to be the responsible one solving somebody else's problem than admit her own life had stalled out in a way she didn't know how to fix. She said it like she was ashamed of it, and I told her there wasn't much shame in it that I could see since I'd spent 2 years doing something similar in reverse, burying myself in an empty house instead of admitting how hollowed out I'd gotten. I didn't have a speech for that. I've never had a speech for anything, which Nancy used to tease me about, and I didn't reach for one now. I just told her, plain as I could, that being safe and being alive aren't always the same thing. That I'd spent 2 years being safe in that house back home, safe and empty, and it had nearly finished me off in a slower way than any typhoon or bad landlord ever could. I told her I understood being scared. I told her I was scared plenty of the time, too. I just wasn't going to let being scared be the only thing I did with what was left of my life. She didn't say I was right. She didn't say she agreed. She just sat there a long while with her hand on my arm, and that was enough. Her last few days in Iloilo looked different from her first few. She came with me to the market with Ellie, argued with a vendor over the price of mangoes with more confidence than I'd have managed, and won, which she reminded me about twice. We took the pump boat over to Guimaras one afternoon, and she sat quiet on the water in a way that looked less like worry and more like something settling. She had dinner with Cap, Nestor's family one evening, laughed at something Tony said that I didn't quite catch, sat with Ricky while he read to me the way he did most afternoons, correcting him gently once, the way I would have. She asked Ellie at one point, without any edge to it at all, how she'd managed on her own after her husband died. And the two of them talked for a long while at that little plastic table, longer than I expected, about things I wasn't part of and didn't need to be. On Guimaras, standing near the little dock waiting for the boat back, she told me she used to be scared of open water as a kid, that Nancy had to talk her into swimming lessons 3 separate summers before it finally took. I hadn't remembered that until she said it. It struck me that there were whole stretches of my own daughter's life I'd let slip past me while I was busy being a husband, a teacher, a man with a schedule, and that maybe part of what this week was doing was handing some of those pieces back to both of us. The morning she was set to fly out, I noticed both tickets were still sitting untouched on the little table by the door, hers and mine, exactly as they'd been printed the day she arrived. Neither one of us had said what was going to happen to them. She hadn't told me what she'd decided, if she'd decided anything at all. And I found myself standing in that apartment with my coffee going cold, watching her fold a shirt into her suitcase. Having absolutely no idea which way this was going to go, we took a tricycle to the airport that morning without saying much. The two of us watching the same streets that had scared her half to death a week earlier go by like they belonged to somebody else now. It struck me, sitting there, that this was the same road I'd ridden alone 11 months before, holding a cracked suitcase and a photograph wrapped in a sweater, not knowing a single soul on the whole island. Now there was a woman beside me who'd learned Ellie's name, who'd sat through a health scare in a country she'd sworn was unsafe, who'd watched a barangay captain treat her father like he mattered to somebody. We got to the counter and I still didn't know what she was going to do. She'd carried both tickets folded in the outside pocket of her bag the whole ride. And I'd caught myself watching that pocket more than I meant to, like I could read the outcome through the fabric if I looked hard enough. She stepped up to the counter first. I heard her give her own confirmation number. I heard the agent ask, out of routine, whether there'd be a second passenger changing anything on the booking. And I watched Diane glance back at me. Just for a second, not long enough to make a thing of it. Before she told the woman no, just her own ticket needed adjusting, the other one could stay as booked. That was it. No speech. No moment where she turned to me and said I was right, or that she'd changed her mind, or any of the things I might have imagined her saying if you'd asked me to guess beforehand. She just quietly changed her own flight to give herself a couple extra days somewhere, though at the time I assumed she meant home, and left mine exactly where it had always been. Unused. Still valid. Still mine to not take. We stood off to the side afterward while she waited on her new boarding pass to print. She didn't look at me with any big meaning in her face. She just said, "Text me when you hear back from Dr. Fernandez about the follow-up." Like it was the most ordinary request in the world, and in a way it was the biggest thing she could have said, because it meant she was already picturing a version of this where I stayed, where there was a follow-up to ask about, where her worrying about me from Green Bay had become a normal thing instead of an argument. I told her I would. She hugged me longer than she had at arrivals a week before, and when she pulled back, her eyes were wet, and she wiped at them fast like she was annoyed at herself for it, which I understood completely. Because I've spent my whole life doing the same thing. I'm not saying I'm not still scared, she told me at the gate, her new boarding pass in her hand instead of the old one. I am. I probably always will be a little, but I'm not going to keep pretending that scared is the same as wrong. I didn't have anything smart to say back to that. I just told her to call when she landed, and she said she would, And this time I believed her the way you believe somebody who's actually going to do it. I want to be honest about what didn't get fixed that week, because it would be easy to make this sound tidier than it was. The $9,000 didn't come back. I never saw most of it again, and I had to sit down with Tony afterward and go through my budget line by line, the way I used to make my shop students go through a materials list before I'd let them near the table saw, figuring out what I could still afford and what I couldn't. I cut back on some of what I'd been giving toward Ricky's school supplies, which I hated doing, and told Ellie honestly why, and she didn't make me feel small about it, just nodded and said we'd manage. Which is the kind of thing people say to each other here that I've come to understand they actually mean. I also stopped eating out as often, learned to cook a few things myself for the first time since Nancy died. Badly at first, less badly after a while. Diane's marriage didn't get fixed either, not in that week and not for a good while after. She called me a few months later to tell me she and Mark were trying counseling, that it was slow, that some days felt more hopeful than others. I didn't push her for more than she wanted to give me. I'd spent enough of my own life keeping things to myself to understand that a person tells you what they're ready to tell you, not what you're curious to hear. What did change slowly over the months after that visit was smaller than a fixed marriage or recovered money, but it was real. Ricky's reading came along enough that his teacher sent a note home with him praising it. And Ellie brought it by the apartment just to show me, proud in a way that made me proud too, in a way I hadn't let myself feel proud of anything in longer than I wanted to count. Capert Nestor asked me, of all things, to help organize repairs on the covered court where the barangay held its meetings and basketball games, on account of my having spent 34 years teaching kids not to lose fingers to power tools. I spent 2 Saturdays measuring lumber with a group of men half my age, arguing good-naturedly about the best way to brace a roof beam, and it occurred to me somewhere in the middle of that second Saturday that nobody there was doing me a favor by including me. They needed the help, and I was useful, which is a different thing entirely, and a thing I hadn't felt in longer than I wanted to count either. There's a phone call I still think about, one Diane made maybe 4 months after that visit, just to talk. No logistics attached to it at all. She told me about a fight she'd had with Mark that hadn't gone anywhere good, and instead of managing it for her the way I might have wanted to, I just listened, the way she'd finally let herself listen to me on that hospital bench. I told her I didn't have an answer for her marriage any more than she'd had one for my choices, and she laughed a little and said that was probably the most useful thing I'd said to her in 2 years. I took it as the compliment I think she meant it to be. Diane came to bring me home. That's still the truest way I know to say what she set out to do, and I don't think she'd argue with me about it even now. What she found instead wasn't an argument that ended in her winning, and it wasn't some postcard version of paradise that talked her out of her fears with a nice sunset. What she found was her father, still stubborn, still hiding things longer than he should, still scared some nights in ways he'd never admit out loud, but also known by name on a street 8,000 miles from where he raised her, missed if he didn't show up, useful to people who had no obligation to need him. I think what changed her mind wasn't any one thing. It was watching all those small, unremarkable proofs stack up over 7 days until the story she'd been telling herself stopped fitting what she was actually seeing. I kept the wedding photograph of Nancy on the shelf by the window after Diane left, same as it had been since I unpacked that first week. But I added another one beside it not long after. Diane, Ricky, and Tony, all squinting into the sun on the little dock at Gomara's the day we crossed over. Nobody posed properly. Ricky's mouth open mid-sentence about something. I didn't put the second photograph up to replace the first one. I'm not interested in replacing anything. I just wanted them sitting next to each other, the old life and whatever this is turning into, because that's closer to the truth of it than picking one or the other ever would be. Nancy's glove is still folded in a drawer in the bedroom. I take it out sometimes. I don't know that I need a reason. I still have that boarding pass, the one Diane left unused. I don't know exactly why I kept it instead of throwing it out with the rest of the paperwork from that week. Maybe because it's the one object I own that never got used for what it was printed for. And somehow, that makes it worth more to me than most things that did. Every so often I come across it in a drawer while I'm looking for something else, and I don't make a ceremony out of finding it. I just look at it a second, put it back, and go on with whatever I was doing. I won't stand here and tell you the Philippines saved me, because that's not honest. And I promised myself a long time ago I wasn't going to sit through this whole account and then hand you a lie at the very end just because it sounds better. It didn't save me. It gave me a street where people notice if I don't come outside, a boy who needs help sounding out his words, a woman who won't let me overpay for lunch, and a daughter who calls now not to check boxes on a form but because she wants to know how the follow-up went. That's not salvation. That's just a life, an ordinary one, built out of people who'd have gotten along fine without me and let me matter to them anyway. I'd make the same choice again tomorrow, knowing exactly what it cost me, because I finally understand the difference between being safe and being alive, and I'm not willing to trade the second one back for the first, not even for my daughter's peace of mind, not even for my own. If you stuck with me this whole way, I'd like to ask one more thing before you go. Subscribe if you haven't, so you don't miss the next one of these, and leave a comment telling me what you'd have done in my shoes. I read every one of them, and I'll see you in the next story.